The sun had barely risen over the rugged peaks of the Cascade Mountains, painting the world in soft shades of amber and silver. A thin mist clung to the forest floor, winding between the towering pines like ghostly ribbons. It was the kind of morning that felt suspended in time, quiet, delicate, almost sacred. Amelia Brooks, 32 years old, stood barefoot on the creaky porch of her cabin, cradling a steaming cup of black coffee between her palms. Her long auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun, and the sleeves of her flannel shirt were rolled up to reveal arms sun-kissed from months spent outdoors. Her jeans were worn at the knees, her boots dusted with the fine grit of yesterday's hike. This place, isolated deep in the mountains of Washington state, had been her refuge for nearly 3 months, a borrowed cabin, a borrowed life. She had come here to heal. After years of teaching in the bustling heart of Portland, after loss had hollowed her from the inside out, Amelia had realized she needed more than therapy or distraction. She needed silence. She needed space. She needed something bigger than herself, something ancient and unyielding, to remind her of the pulse of life that still beat under everything broken. Out here, the nearest ranger outpost was 15 miles away by rough, winding roads, and cell service was nothing more than a cruel rumor. Supplies had to be carefully rationed. Even on good days, she was profoundly alone, with nothing but the whisper of the wind and the creak of old pine boughs for company. Yet in that loneliness, Amelia had begun to breathe again. The wilderness did not judge. It simply existed. And in its raw, merciless beauty, she had found a strange kind of peace. This morning had started like any other. She had built a small fire, brewed her coffee, and sat outside to listen to the world wake up. Birds chirped somewhere far off. A woodpecker tapped at a hollow log. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. Then, she heard it, a dragging sound. Not footsteps. Not the gentle crush of an animal passing through underbrush. No, this was something heavier, something deliberate. The low, gritty scrape of weight against gravel. Amelia's muscles tightened instinctively. She set her coffee cup down silently and edged closer to the railing, peering through the thinning mist toward the source of the sound. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be a lost hiker, maybe someone injured and dragging a pack. But no human made that kind of noise. And then she saw it. A massive grizzly bear emerged from the fog, the golden brown of its thick fur dulled by dirt and clumps of pine sap. The bear's shoulders were broad, scarred by old battles, and its head was low, jaws clamped tightly around the end of a battered, torn canvas bag. Every step seemed to strain against gravity, muscles bunching visibly beneath the heavy coat of fur. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She froze where she stood, every instinct screaming at her to retreat inside and bolt the door. Grizzlies were not creatures to be admired from a porch. They were raw, unpredictable power. She glanced back at the door, where her phone sat uselessly on the kitchen counter. No signal. No quick rescue. The bear didn't charge. Didn't roar. It just dragged the heavy bag with grim, grinding determination across the clearing, coming closer and closer to Amelia's cabin. It was not just the danger that made Amelia's heart pound harder against her ribs. It was something about the bear's movements, heavy, slow, almost sorrowful. As if it wasn't here to threaten. As if it was carrying a burden too great for its massive frame. Amelia couldn't look away. She had no way of knowing that in the next few moments, her life, and the life of another, would change forever. Amelia remained rooted to the spot, every nerve in her body coiled tight. The massive grizzly trudged forward, its enormous paws leaving deep impressions in the damp earth. A cloud of dust and pine needles rose where the canvas bag dragged behind it, snagging on roots and rocks. It was a surreal sight, one that defied every natural instinct she had ever learned about bears. Grizzlies didn't behave this way. They didn't lug human-made objects across open clearings toward the scent of fire and people. They didn't move with this kind of weary, desperate purpose. The bear stopped about 40 feet from her porch. It dropped the torn duffel bag onto the ground with a heavy thud. Then, almost with deliberate care, the grizzly backed away, retreating several steps toward the shadowed edge of the forest. It sat down on its haunches, massive head tilted slightly, as if waiting. Amelia could hardly breathe. Every part of her screamed to get back inside, to lock the door and hide. But something she couldn't quite name, held her there. It wasn't fear that kept her frozen. It was wonder. It was the unbearable weight of curiosity. The bag moved. Amelia's heart nearly exploded in her chest. It didn't move because the bear had shifted it. It moved from the inside, a subtle, pitiful rustle that suggested life where there should have been none. She gripped the porch railing so tightly her knuckles went white. She could still see the bear, half shrouded by the mist and pines. It wasn't advancing. It wasn't growling or threatening. It sat still, its heavy sides heaving with slow breaths, its eyes fixed on the bag, and on her. A thought, wild and impossible, sparked in Amelia's mind. The bear wanted her to see. Against every survival instinct she had, she stepped down off the porch. The wood creaked beneath her bare feet. Her body trembled with adrenaline, every step forward a battle between logic and the strange, magnetic pull of whatever was happening here. She inched closer to the bag. 10 feet away. 8. 5. The smell hit her first, an acrid blend of old blood, dirt, and something else, something like fear itself soaked into the fibers. The bag was torn along one side, the zipper half chewed open. It looked like it had been through hell. With trembling fingers, Amelia reached forward and peeled the canvas back. Her breath caught. She fell to her knees. Inside, curled into a tight, shivering ball, was a tiny bear cub. Its fur was a deep chocolate brown, almost black when wet, and patches of lighter tan fur circled its eyes like tear stains. Its tiny body was alarmingly thin, ribs pressed visibly against loose skin. A bruise darkened one side of its flank. One paw was scratched and raw. The cub blinked up at her, slow and sluggish, as if the effort of moving its eyelids cost too much. Amelia felt the world tilt beneath her. The bear mother had dragged her wounded child, across rocks, across forest, across danger, to lay it at the feet of a human. Not to threaten, not to attack. To plead. The mother grizzly rumbled softly from the edge of the woods. It wasn't a growl. It was something deeper, a sound that vibrated in Amelia's bones, a sound of grief, of surrender, of hope. For the first time in a long while, Amelia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She knelt there in the dirt, the cold seeping into her skin, the mist curling around her hair, and understood with terrifying clarity, she was being asked for help. Not demanded. Not forced. Asked. The enormity of that trust buckled her. Somewhere deep in the forest, another branch cracked. A bird took flight. The world kept turning. But here, in this clearing, under the pale morning sun, time seemed to hold its breath. Amelia wiped her eyes and whispered to the cub, so softly it barely stirred the air between them, "I'm here. I'm not going to hurt you." Behind her, the mother bear sat like a monument, silent and still, waiting for an answer. Amelia knelt by the battered canvas bag, heart hammering painfully against her ribs. She could hear the faint rustle of the cub's breathing, shallow and broken. Every instinct inside her was a storm of doubt and fear. This was a wild animal, a creature born of the forest, not a stray kitten lost in the rain. Yet the cub lay there, too weak even to lift its head fully, trembling in the cold dirt. The weight of the mother bear's gaze bore down on her like a physical force. Amelia could feel it, steady and unwavering from the edge of the woods. Not a threat. Not a demand. Just an endless, aching hope. She knew she couldn't leave the cub here. The night would bring colder temperatures, and predators. The tiny, battered body wouldn't survive alone. She had to act. Slowly, speaking in a soft, low voice more for her own sake than the bear's, Amelia eased an old towel from her back pocket, the same one she used to wipe down muddy boots or dry dripping firewood. She spread it out beside the cub, her hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unfold it properly. The cub flinched as she moved closer but didn't make a sound. Amelia carefully slid one hand under its frail belly, the other supporting its hindquarters. The little body was alarmingly light, no more than 30 pounds at most. A faint whimper escaped the cub's throat, but it made no attempt to struggle. It simply sagged against her hands, trusting her with a quiet surrender that shattered Amelia's heart into 1,000 pieces. She wrapped the cub gently in the towel, cradling it against her chest. The cub's tiny paws twitched once, then went still, nestled against the worn fabric of her flannel shirt. Amelia could feel its shallow breaths against her collarbone, could smell the mix of pine sap, smoke, and earth tangled in its damp fur. Standing up was an act of sheer willpower. Every movement had to be slow, deliberate, so as not to provoke a sudden reaction from the mother bear. She kept her eyes low, her posture non-threatening, remembering every survival tip she'd ever read in dusty hiking guides. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the bear shift slightly, massive muscles rolling under the battered fur. Amelia held her breath. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and this fragile piece could be broken. But the bear did not charge. She did not roar. She simply watched. With the cub bundled tightly against her, Amelia backed slowly toward the cabin. Inch by inch, step by careful step. The distance between the porch and the clearing seemed impossibly long now, stretched by tension and fear. Each soft thud of her bare feet on the gravel seemed to echo louder in the heavy morning air. She reached the porch. She climbed the steps. She dared one glance over her shoulder. The mother bear still sat at the edge of the forest, an unmoving, patient sentinel. Amelia turned and slipped inside the cabin, the wooden door creaking softly as she pulled it closed behind her. She locked it out of habit, though deep down she knew no lock would stop a bear if it truly decided to come through. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and cedar. The fireplace crackled lowly, casting a warm amber glow over the simple furniture. Amelia sank down onto the floor beside the hearth, still cradling the cub, her legs giving out under the weight of everything that had just happened. The cub stirred faintly, its nose burrowing against the crook of her arm. Its breathing was irregular, but it was breathing. For now, that was enough. Amelia pressed her forehead against the towel-wrapped bundle and closed her eyes, whispering a silent promise she wasn't sure she could keep but knew she had to make anyway. "I'll protect you," she murmured into the tiny, trembling form. "I swear." Outside, through the frosted window, the first flakes of snow began to drift down, silent witnesses to a fragile, trembling trust that had been born between a woman, a cub, and the wild. The cabin was warmer now, the fire crackling with new life as Amelia fed it logs from the dwindling pile beside the hearth. She moved with a quiet urgency, her body still buzzing with adrenaline but her mind laser-focused on the fragile life she had cradled in from the cold. The cub lay on an old wool blanket she had spread near the stove, a soft towel still loosely wrapped around his trembling form. He had not made a sound since Amelia set him down, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he had slipped away in the warmth. But then his tiny chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Amelia sat cross-legged beside him, unwilling to move too far. She had no veterinary training, no experience with wild animals beyond the occasional article or nature documentary. What she had was instinct and a desperate, pulsing need to do something, anything, to help. She filled a shallow bowl with lukewarm water and placed it a few inches from the cub's nose. At first, there was no response. The cub remained still, his paws twitching occasionally as if chasing something in a dream. Amelia dipped her fingers into the bowl and gently flicked a few drops onto his nose. The cub stirred. His eyes fluttered open, muddy brown eyes, glazed with exhaustion but flickering faintly with life. He sniffed weakly at the air, then, after a long, painful moment, extended his tiny pink tongue to lap at the water. Tears pricked Amelia's eyes again. Relief hit her so hard she had to brace herself with one hand against the floor. She hadn't realized until that moment how tightly she had been holding her breath. It wasn't much. A few sips of water. A tiny movement. But it was life. It was hope. As the cub drank, Amelia inspected him more closely. His injuries, though ugly, didn't seem fatal. Bruises marred his flank, and the cut on his paw was crusted with dirt, but there were no obvious broken bones. His ribs were prominent, and his fur was matted and thin in places, but his breathing was stronger now, more rhythmic. "You're a fighter," she whispered, reaching out cautiously to stroke the towel near his shoulder, careful not to touch bare fur yet. "You're tougher than you look, little one." The cub didn't flinch at her voice. He simply kept drinking, slow and methodical, as if he knew on some deep, primal level that he was safe here, at least for now. Night crept in slowly, turning the misty morning into a deep, ink-black darkness outside the windows. The snow fell harder now, tapping softly against the glass panes like fingers seeking entrance. The forest beyond the cabin was a shifting wall of shadows and secrets. Amelia didn't care. She had locked the door, fed the fire, and placed herself between the cub and the wild world that had almost swallowed him whole. For tonight, they were both tucked away in a fragile bubble of warmth and hope. Sitting there beside him, watching his tiny sides rise and fall, Amelia realized she had never been less alone. And somewhere out there, she knew, the mother bear waited in the darkness, trusting her with something more precious than life itself. The first signs came the next morning, just as the pale winter sun struggled to lift itself over the jagged ridges of the Cascade Mountains. Amelia stepped onto the porch, bundled in a thick wool sweater, her boots crunching softly against a thin crust of fresh snow. In her arms, a faded towel warmed by the fire cradled a small bundle of food scraps, bits of apple, a few torn pieces of bread, some leftover rice. She had hardly slept. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of the wind had set her nerves on edge. But the cub had made it through the night, curled tightly on the blanket, his breathing even and steady. That, at least, was a small victory. As she set the bundle of food near the edge of the porch, Amelia's eyes caught something unusual: paw prints. Huge ones. They circled the cabin once, then again, looping carefully around the perimeter. Deep imprints, spaced evenly, deliberate. She crouched down, brushing loose snow away from the edges to get a better look. There was no mistaking it. These were bear tracks, broad pads, long claw marks at the tips. And they were fresh. Her breath misted in the cold morning air. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line. No movement. No sound but the distant groan of ice-laden branches. The mother bear had come back during the night, moving silently through the storm, close enough to touch the walls of the cabin, to listen at the door. Amelia stood there for a long time, heart pounding. The message was clear. The mother hadn't abandoned them. She was watching. Waiting. Back inside, the cub stirred weakly as Amelia knelt beside him. She offered him a few drops of water again, wiping the crust from the corners of his eyes with a damp cloth. He responded, lifting his head briefly before letting it fall back onto the blanket. Each tiny improvement filled her with a kind of fierce, protective joy she hadn't known she was capable of. Days passed in a slow, fragile rhythm. Every morning, Amelia left small offerings of food by the porch. Sometimes it would be taken. Other times it would remain, dusted with frost. But always, the tracks would appear, circling, pausing, a silent sentinel keeping vigil through the night. Amelia began to feel the bear's presence even when she couldn't see her. It was a feeling in the pit of her stomach, a prickling at the base of her neck. A watchfulness, not menacing but solemn, as though the forest itself had eyes. The cub, whom Amelia had begun to call Little Ash in her mind because of the soot-colored fur that clung to his sides, grew stronger. He no longer whimpered in his sleep. His appetite returned, tentative but persistent. He lifted his head when she spoke, his dark eyes following her movements across the room. Still, Amelia knew it was too soon to celebrate. He was fragile, his survival hanging by a thread woven of hope and sheer stubbornness. But for now, here in the cradle of firelight and patience, he was safe. And somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the flickering shadows and drifting snow, a mother bear kept her silent watch, unseen but never far. The storm came without warning, roaring down from the northern peaks like a living thing. By late afternoon, the wind battered the cabin with howling force, rattling the old wooden shutters and sending bursts of snow spiraling through the cracks in the porch beams. The sky turned the color of slate, and the forest disappeared behind a swirling white wall. Amelia doubled her efforts to secure the cabin. She stuffed towels against the doors, latched every window, and stoked the fire until it blazed hot against the growing cold. Little Ash huddled in his blanket nest by the hearth, his body trembling slightly with each new gust that shook the walls. The power flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the cabin into shadow. Amelia lit the emergency lanterns she kept tucked under the kitchen sink, their warm glow casting long, jittery shadows across the floorboards. The storm howled outside, an endless chorus of rage and ice. She sat close to Ash, one hand resting lightly on his back, humming softly under her breath. Songs she hadn't thought of in years, old lullabies from her childhood, slipped free in the darkness. The cub's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of her voice. Then she heard it. A thump. Low, heavy, deliberate. Amelia's heart lurched. She rose carefully to her feet, cradling a lantern in one hand. The thump came again, closer this time, vibrating through the thick wooden door. Not a crash. Not a frantic pounding. Just a weight. A presence. She moved toward the door, every step slow and measured. Pressing her eye against a sliver of glass in the window, she peered out into the raging night. There, standing on the porch, barely more than a shadow against the storm, was the mother bear. Ice clung to her fur in jagged shards, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Her massive frame was hunched with exhaustion, every movement deliberate and slow. She didn't growl. She didn't advance. She simply stood there, head lowered, her eyes fixed not on Amelia, but on the room behind her. On Ash. The cub was awake now, sitting up weakly, his small head turned toward the door as if he, too, could feel the pull in the air, the invisible thread that stretched between him and his mother. Amelia opened the door a crack, cold wind slashing at her face. The bear didn't flinch. She stepped forward just once, pressing one huge paw onto the porch boards, the very place where Amelia had first found the abandoned bag days earlier. And then the bear lifted her head and looked directly at Amelia. It wasn't a look of anger. It wasn't fear. It was gratitude. Something deep and raw and wordless passed between them. A mother's trust, a final goodbye. Then, with one slow, deliberate turn, the bear stepped back into the storm, her massive frame swallowed by the curtain of snow. She did not look back. Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, the lantern trembling in her hand, tears slipping hot down her cheeks despite the biting cold. She knew, without question, that she would never see the mother bear again. Closing the door slowly, she returned to Ash, gathering him gently into her arms. He whimpered softly against her chest, but there was no panic in his voice. Only a quiet resignation, as if he understood too. They were alone now. But they had been chosen. The storm raged deep into the night, shaking the world to its very bones. But inside the little cabin, wrapped in the warmth of firelight and memory, Amelia held the cub close and whispered promises into the dark, promises she would spend the rest of her life trying to keep. Morning came thin and bitter, the storm's fury spent but leaving behind a world frozen and still. The snow lay thick across the clearing, sculpted into strange, windswept shapes. Trees bowed under the weight of the ice, their branches creaking like old bones in the heavy air. The sky above was a hard, metallic gray. Amelia packed quickly, urgency driving every movement. She layered on her thickest jeans, 2 sweaters, and her heavy canvas jacket. Her boots, already battered from months of use, were laced tight against the biting cold. She filled a backpack with essentials: trail mix, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, a flashlight, extra towels, and lined the inside with a thick wool blanket. Ash, still weak but stronger than he had been days before, watched her from the nest by the fire. His chocolate-brown eyes followed her movements, confused but trusting. When the backpack was ready, Amelia lifted him carefully. He weighed little more than a small sack of flour, but every ounce was precious. She wrapped him in the blanket and nestled him inside the open pack, his tiny face peeking out just over the top. He didn't struggle. He simply blinked up at her with a soft, wheezing sigh. "You're going to be okay, little guy," she whispered, adjusting the straps across her shoulders. "We're going to find help." The nearest ranger station, according to her outdated map, was 6 miles away by foot. In good weather, with a clear trail, it might take 2 hours. But now, with the snow knee-deep in places and the wind slicing like knives through the trees, it would take much longer. Amelia stepped off the porch and into the snowdrift, her boots sinking immediately. She braced herself, shifting the pack's weight, and began to move forward, one slow step at a time. The forest was eerily silent, muffled by the thick layer of snow. Even the birds were absent. Each breath Amelia took burned cold in her lungs, the air so sharp it felt like glass. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. 2 miles into the journey, she saw something ahead, a dark shape half buried near a fallen log, a patch of fur dusted with frost. Her stomach twisted. She moved closer, the snow crunching under her boots. It was the mother bear. She lay curled tightly into herself, her massive body still and peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. There were no wounds, no blood. Only a quiet, heartbreaking stillness. Her fur was matted with ice, her paws tucked close to her chest. Amelia dropped to her knees beside her, tears blurring her vision. She unzipped the backpack gently. Ash poked his head out, sniffing the cold air. For a moment, he just looked. Then, with trembling legs, he climbed out of the bag and tottered across the snow to his mother's side. He nudged her gently with his nose. Waited. When she didn't move, he curled up beside her, pressing his tiny body against her massive shoulder, his breath steaming softly in the freezing air. Amelia wept openly now, her hands shaking as she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over the mother's frozen fur. "You brought him to me," she whispered through choked sobs. "You did everything you could." The minutes stretched, heavy and endless. Finally, Ash stirred. He rose on shaky legs and stumbled back toward Amelia, pressing against her side with a soft, mournful whine. She gathered him back into her arms, holding him close. There was no time to waste now. With a final, silent goodbye to the mother bear, Amelia pushed to her feet and continued down the trail, carrying the cub who had been trusted to her with everything one wild, desperate mother had left to give. The trail grew rougher as Amelia pressed on, the snow deepening with every mile. Her muscles burned from the effort of trudging forward, but she clung tightly to the backpack on her shoulders, where Ash nestled quietly against the warmth of her body. His presence, his tiny heartbeat thudding faintly against her back, pushed her onward when exhaustion begged her to stop. Just when her strength threatened to fail, she caught sight of it, a thin wisp of smoke curling into the gray sky. Beyond a stand of sagging evergreens, an old shack came into view, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, a battered American flag frozen stiff against the pole. The ranger station. Amelia stumbled toward it, hope and fear wrestling inside her. She raised a gloved fist and pounded against the heavy wooden door, the sound muffled by the thick air. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing a tall, weathered man with a gray beard and wary blue eyes. He took one look at Amelia, her tear-streaked face, her trembling body, and ushered her inside without a word. The cabin was small but blessedly warm, the heat from a wood stove filling the cramped space. Amelia lowered the backpack carefully to the floor, unzipping it to reveal Ash's tiny, weary face. The ranger knelt beside them, his hand surprisingly gentle as he inspected the cub. "Where in the hell did you find him?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. Amelia sat heavily in a chair, her body aching, her words tumbling out in a rush, the dragging sound, the mother bear, the battered bag, the long days of silent visits, the final storm, the heartbreaking discovery in the snow. The ranger, whose name was Harold Mason according to the stitched patch on his heavy jacket, listened without interruption, his face carved into hard lines of concentration. When she finished, the room fell into a thick, thoughtful silence. Finally, he leaned back on his heels and sighed. "You know the law," he said. "Wild animals, even abandoned ones, they go through official channels. Wildlife authorities. Rehabilitation centers. They decide." Amelia stiffened, her heart clenching. She understood. She did. But the thought of strangers ripping Ash from her arms, placing him in some cold, clinical facility, was unbearable. She opened her mouth to protest, but Harold raised a hand. "But," he said slowly, glancing from her to the cub, sometimes the law needs a little time to catch up with what's right." Amelia blinked, not daring to hope. "I'll report him as a special case," Harold said. "You'll be his caretaker, at least for now. Until a better plan comes along. If it ever does." Tears blurred Amelia's vision again, but this time they were different. Lighter. Full of something she hadn't dared feel in a long time. Gratitude. Ash pressed his tiny body closer to her leg, as if sensing the shift. Amelia reached down and ruffled the damp fur behind his ears. "You're safe now," she whispered. And this time, she believed it. Spring arrived early in the Cascade Mountains, the snow melting into fast-moving streams that carved new paths through the forest floor. The trees shed their heavy coats of ice, exchanging them for a vibrant canopy of green. Tiny wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground, stubborn and bright. Inside the cabin, life had shifted just as dramatically. Ash, no longer the frail, trembling cub Amelia had carried from the storm, was growing stronger by the day. His legs, once wobbly and unsure, now carried him from room to room with clumsy determination. His fur had thickened into a rich, chocolate-brown coat that gleamed when the sunlight slanted through the windows. Amelia watched him one morning as he pawed at the front door, his breath fogging the glass. She smiled and rose from the table, sliding open the door so he could bound onto the porch. His playful huff echoed into the forest, a sound full of life and endless curiosity. She had named him Ash, not because of what had almost destroyed him, but because of what he had survived. Like the embers of a fire, he had clung to life even when it seemed impossible, burning quietly until he found a way to blaze anew. They lived simply. Amelia spent her mornings repairing the cabin, gathering supplies from the nearby town, and preparing meals that always included scraps saved for Ash. She didn't try to tame him. She didn't put a collar around his neck or teach him tricks. Their bond wasn't about control, it was about respect, a silent agreement between two souls who had both been lost and had found something worth fighting for in each other. Every evening, Ash would curl beneath the porch, close enough to hear her movements inside, close enough that if she pressed her ear to the floorboards, she could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. It was a comfort unlike anything Amelia had known before. And always, she remembered the mother bear, the way she had dragged that torn bag across the clearing, the way she had watched from the trees, the way she had placed her faith in a stranger. Amelia honored that trust every single day. One crisp morning, as the mist burned off the forest floor, she hiked the trail she had traveled all those months ago, the path where she had found the mother bear's final resting place. Ash bounded ahead of her, pausing often to sniff wildflowers or to wait for her to catch up. They reached the clearing together, now soft with moss and early spring blooms. Amelia stood there for a long moment, eyes closed, breathing in the clean, damp air. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's okay." Ash let out a soft huff and leaned against her leg, his weight solid, real, alive. In the distance, the forest moved, branches parting, a shape too large to be coincidence. Amelia caught a glimpse, a grizzly, smaller than the one she remembered but powerful, watching them with curious, steady eyes. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a reminder. Some bonds, Amelia realized, were never broken. They simply changed shape, carried forward by those brave enough to trust, and strong enough to let go when the time was right. She knelt and wrapped her arms around Ash, pressing her face into the thick fur at his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, to the mother bear, to the wilderness, to the impossible miracle that had found her at the end of the world. And then, smiling through tears, she stood and walked home, with Ash trailing close at her side. Sometimes, trust is the greatest gift, and the greatest risk. This story reminds us that even in our most vulnerable moments, there's courage in reaching out, and even more courage in answering that call. In a world where fear often speaks louder than hope, it's the quiet acts of faith, between strangers, between species, that truly shape the future. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe every small act of compassion can echo far beyond what we imagine. Today, we challenge you, look around and find a way to be someone's safe place, even if it's just for a moment. And if you found yourself moved by this incredible journey, consider joining our community by subscribing to Paw Prints and Stories, where every heartbeat, paw print, and wild miracle has a story worth telling. What would you choose, to walk away, or to trust a silent plea for help?